Throughout history, the lives of powerful queens have fascinated and challenged the way we think about leadership, love, and legacy. These remarkable women stood at the crossroads of two forces society often told them they couldn't have at once: power and love. Faced with political threats, cultural expectations, and personal ambition, many of them made a bold choice: to rule with unmatched strength, even if it meant standing alone. Their decisions not only shaped the empires they led but also redefined what it meant to be a woman in power. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time. In this video we'll explore the compelling stories of queens who chose power instead of love, rulers who sacrificed personal relationships to build lasting legacies, outwit patriarchy, and claim their place in history. Stay with us as we uncover how these sovereigns changed the world by putting the crown before the heart. Throughout history, the image of powerful women has often been confined within narrow binaries, most commonly the perception that a woman can either rule with strength and independence or be tender and romantic, but rarely both. When it comes to queens, this dichotomy becomes even more pronounced. The decision to prioritize power over romantic entanglements has frequently been interpreted not as a strategic choice, but as a sacrifice, a loss, or even a personal failing. Yet for many female rulers throughout time, the choice to forego love or marriage was far from an emotional tragedy. It was a deliberate, calculated assertion of autonomy, legacy, and sovereignty. For centuries, the roles assigned to women were rooted in submission, emotional labor, and relational identity: daughter, wife, mother. Leadership, authority, and public decision-making were considered the domain of men. When women ascended to power, particularly in monarchies, they faced a contradiction. To rule effectively, they had to wield masculine-coded authority, but to remain publicly palatable, they were expected to conform to feminine ideals. This tug-of-war led to an unfair narrative construction. Queens who remained unmarried or distanced themselves from romantic entanglements were deemed cold, calculating, or even unnatural. On the other hand, those who engaged in love affairs or passionate unions were seen as weak, manipulated, or easily compromised. This creates a false dichotomy: the idea that a queen must choose between love and power, as though both cannot coexist in the same life without one undermining the other. While kings could marry for politics, take lovers without consequence, and still be regarded as authoritative, queens often faced intense scrutiny for doing the same. Their love lives were not private matters; they were national concerns. Romantic alliances, especially marriages, could open doors to foreign influence, shift political balances, or challenge a queen's sole legitimacy. Thus, for many, rejecting love or marriage was not a rejection of emotion, but an assertion of control. The central question arises: why did some queens consciously choose power, rule, and legacy over romantic companionship or marriage? What did they understand about their context, their roles, and the demands of sovereignty that made such a choice necessary or at least preferable? And how have we, as modern observers, misunderstood these decisions by applying romantic or moralistic lenses that do not do justice to their strategic brilliance? Across history, several remarkable queens took that path. Elizabeth I of England stands as perhaps the most famous example. Her identity as the Virgin Queen was not just a personal branding. Her refusal to marry became a political strategy, a shield against foreign manipulation, and a means to preserve sole rule. Despite countless suitors and years of courtship negotiations, Elizabeth remained unmarried, and in doing so, retained unprecedented control over her reign in a deeply patriarchal world. Cleopatra VII of Egypt is often remembered for her liaisons with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, but her story has been wildly distorted by Roman propaganda and later retellings. What if those relationships were less about romance and more about survival and strategic positioning? Cleopatra was, above all, a ruler trying to maintain her kingdom's independence in the face of Roman expansion. Her lovers were also political allies, men whose power she could leverage to secure Egypt's future. Her choices were far more layered than the love story many popular retellings suggest. In China, Wu Zetian rose from the position of concubine to become the only woman to rule as emperor in her own right. Her journey to power was marked by ruthless intelligence, political manipulation, and strategic elimination of rivals. She chose power not just once, but repeatedly over family, over custom, and over love. Rather than being guided by romance, Wu shaped a dynasty with iron will and foresight, defying every expectation of her gender and time. Queen Nzinga of Angola, facing the brutal expansion of Portuguese colonialism, rejected European marriage structures outright. She dressed in traditionally male warrior attire, took concubines of her own, and positioned herself as a military and political equal to any European adversary. Love or personal relationships, in the way European queens might have experienced them, were not a priority in her rule. Resistance, survival, and sovereignty were. In Russia, Catherine the Great seized the throne through a coup and ruled for decades with vision and ambition. Although she had many lovers, she never remarried after disposing of her husband. Her romantic relationships were compartmentalized. Pleasure and companionship were separate from rule and governance. For her, intimacy was not a path to power, it was a private choice, often disconnected from her public role as empress. These stories and others like them reveal a recurring truth. For many queens, love was a luxury they could not afford, at least not in the traditional sense. Some of them may have known great passion, but they did not allow it to define or control them. Others intentionally avoided romantic entanglements altogether, knowing such connections could threaten their authority, dilute their independence, or make them vulnerable to exploitation. Yet popular culture continues to recycle old tropes. The love-struck queen who throws away her kingdom for romance, or the cold and unloving ruler who regrets her loneliness. These characterizations flatten history and rob real women of their agency. Figures like Elizabeth I or Wu Zetian weren't simply devoid of love or incapable of emotion. They made choices, often incredibly difficult ones, to prioritize what they saw as their duty and vision. Our fascination with their personal lives reveals more about us than it does about them. Why are we so eager to believe that a powerful woman must be missing something if she's alone? Why do we search for regret in their solitude, or paint their legacies as incomplete without love? Perhaps the more interesting question is not what they sacrificed but what they built. Nations, dynasties, reforms, resistance movements, and lasting legends. This video explores the complex, layered, and often misunderstood stories of queens who chose power. Not to romanticize their rule, but to understand their choices in context, not as a tragedy, but as a redefinition of what it meant to be a sovereign woman. These queens were not victims of loveless reigns, they were architects of their own legacy. In the long arc of history, women have often been perceived as symbols of continuity, virtue, and family rather than as agents of command, strategy, or leadership. From ancient civilizations to early modern empires, gender roles were socially engineered to support male authority and female submission. Kings ruled. Men conquered. Women nurtured, bore heirs, and obeyed. When women did rise to positions of power, often in exceptional circumstances, it was usually because the typical male heir was unavailable, and their ascension was seen as a temporary deviation rather than a rightful inheritance. The concept of female rulership in many societies was not just rare, it was systematically discouraged, resisted, or erased. And when it occurred, it had to be justified in extraordinary terms. Divine right, lineage desperation, or posthumous myth-making. In the ancient world, female rulers like Hatshepsut of Egypt or Sobenferu were exceptions, not norms. Even as they wielded great authority, they had to present themselves in masculine terms or as semi-divine figures. In China, Confucian doctrine strictly emphasized filial piety and male primacy. Women were expected to be obedient daughters, faithful wives, and self-effacing mothers. Governance was seen as a male duty ordained by heaven. Similar attitudes persisted across medieval Europe, where women were legally minors under their fathers or husbands, and rarely received the education or experience needed to rule effectively. Queens consort were common, but queens regnant were anomalies. Even where law allowed women to inherit the throne, custom often blocked their exercise of real authority. The early modern period brought little relief. In Renaissance Europe, monarchies were tightly bound to dynastic politics, with the fate of entire nations resting on the ability of kings to produce legitimate male heirs. A queen who ruled in her own right, particularly if unmarried, disrupted the expected patriarchal order. The law might allow her rule, but the culture resisted it. Her every move would be questioned, her advisors distrusted, her femininity weaponized against her. If she made bold decisions, she was rash. She hesitated, she was weak. The throne was a stage on which she was constantly expected to justify her right to be there. Layered atop these expectations was a powerful legal and social mechanism: marriage. For most of history, marriage was not about romance. It was about property, lineage, and alliance. For kings, marriage could bring foreign territory, dynastic peace, or a strategic treaty, yet their position as ruler was rarely challenged by their choice of spouse. For queens, however, marriage often meant immediate and permanent compromise. A husband, especially if he was of noble or royal blood, might demand a co-ruling status or be viewed by foreign powers as the real decision-maker. Thus, for queens regnant, those ruling in their own right, marriage was a potential political trap. Marriage for a queen wasn't just a personal choice. It was a matter of state, often orchestrated by courts, councils and foreign emissaries. Once married, a queen's authority could be overtaken by her husband's ambitions. If the husband was a foreign prince, it raised immediate concerns about the sovereignty of her realm. Would she continue to rule for her own nation's interests, or would she become an instrument of her husband's homeland? This question was not just theoretical, it played out in real time throughout history. Take, for example, the case of Mary I of England. When she married Philip II of Spain, the union was deeply unpopular among her subjects. English Protestants feared domination by Catholic Spain. Politicians feared the loss of independence. Mary's authority, already precarious due to religious turmoil, became further clouded by her husband's outsized presence. Though technically she remained queen, many viewed Philip as the true power. Her own identity and legacy were eclipsed in her attempts to fulfill what society deemed her feminine and royal duty, to marry and produce an heir. Even in less dramatic cases, marriage often meant the queen was expected to yield political ground. In patriarchal systems, a wife was meant to be submissive, and this expectation didn't vanish with royal status. A queen who tried to retain control in her marriage risked being seen as unnatural or overbearing. If she sought to rule alone, she was branded arrogant. She stepped back, she could be marginalized. Either way, the institution of marriage served as a vehicle for limiting female power. This explains why many queens throughout history either delayed marriage, strategically refused it, or carefully redefined its meaning. For some, avoidance of marriage was not a rejection of love, but a deliberate protection of sovereignty. Their reigns challenged the status quo by proving that a woman could lead without the mediation of a husband. In doing so, they also redefined what it meant to be both a ruler and a woman. Elizabeth I is perhaps the most iconic example of this calculated defiance. From early in her reign, she was pressured to marry, both for diplomatic reasons and to secure the Tudor succession. Suitors came and went: Philip of Spain, Archduke Charles of Austria, the Duke of Anjou, but Elizabeth skillfully used these negotiations to her political advantage without ever committing. Her refusal to marry was not rooted in a lack of admirers or an aversion to companionship. It was a masterstroke of statecraft. Marriage to a powerful foreign prince could have undermined her independence. Marriage to an English nobleman would have invited factionalism and power struggles. Remaining single allowed her to remain solely accountable to her people and parliament. She crafted an image of herself as married to the nation, emphasizing her sacred role as sovereign over personal desire. Wu Zetian of China took a different route. Rising from the ranks of concubines, she manipulated her position at court to eventually become the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own name. Her authority came not through marriage, but through the systematic dismantling of male-dominated political structures and the careful elevation of her own loyalists. Though she used relationships with male rulers to ascend, she never allowed romantic ties to define or restrain her power. Once she assumed the throne, she ruled with unapologetic authority, refusing to share power with any man. Queen Nzinga of Angola is another case in which marriage avoidance was a declaration of strength. Facing colonial aggression, she knew that aligning herself through marriage, whether with African rivals or European colonizers, would weaken her position. She often presented herself in masculine terms, adopting male dress and military behavior to assert authority. Instead of taking a political husband, she maintained control of her own body and image, taking concubines if she wished but never subjecting herself to patriarchal marriage arrangements. Her independence became a symbol of resistance against foreign domination. Even Catherine the Great of Russia, who married to gain a foothold in Russian politics, understood the limitations of being tied to a husband in power. She maneuvered around her husband Peter III until she arranged his removal, assuming the throne herself. Though she had numerous lovers throughout her life, she never married again. Her private life was separated from her public role, and she guarded that boundary fiercely. These women understood that marriage was more than a personal union, it was a political contract with deep implications for sovereignty, autonomy, and legacy. By refusing or redefining marriage, they challenged deeply held norms and asserted a radical idea: that a woman could lead, make decisions, and shape nations without the oversight or validation of a man. Their actions may seem radical, but they were often driven by necessity. In environments where women's power was considered unnatural or threatening, queens had to walk an incredibly fine line. One misstep could end their rule or their lives. Avoiding marriage was not about coldness or fear of intimacy, it was about survival, strategy, and maintaining control over the machinery of governance. The refusal of marriage by queens was thus a powerful political act. It was a statement that their legitimacy did not need to be reinforced through a man. It allowed them to define leadership on their own terms and to create legacies unbound by the expectations of queenship as a supportive, background role. These women were not anomalies of history, they were pioneers of female sovereignty in its most defiant form. What ties all of these examples together is the awareness these women had of the structures working against them. They knew what was expected: to marry, to produce heirs, to serve as symbols of dynastic continuity. Instead, they chose to rule. Their decisions were not merely personal but revolutionary. In refusing to be defined by love, they redefined power. Elizabeth I of England stands as one of the most iconic female monarchs in world history, not only for her long and influential reign, but for the deliberate, strategic decision she made to remain unmarried, thereby reshaping what it meant to be a queen. Her image as the Virgin Queen was not merely symbolic. It became a cornerstone of her authority and one of the most enduring political myths of her era. But to understand why she chose to rule alone, one must begin with her early years filled with danger, betrayal, and lessons in political survival that would define her entire life. Elizabeth was born into one of the most volatile periods in English history. Her father, King Henry VIII, had broken from the Catholic Church to marry her mother, Anne Boleyn. When Anne failed to produce a male heir, she fell from favor. In 1536, Anne was executed on charges of adultery, incest, and treason, a highly politicized move that sent shockwaves through the court. Elizabeth, just a toddler, was declared illegitimate. The trauma of her mother's death and the loss of royal status left a psychological imprint that Elizabeth would carry for the rest of her life. Unlike her half-sister Mary, who was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon and had once been the apple of the realm's eye, Elizabeth was a political liability. She learned early that her survival depended on discretion, self-restraint, and political caution. As she grew older, her precarious position became even clearer. Her Protestant leanings made her a target under Mary I's Catholic reign. She was implicated in conspiracies, especially the Wyatt Rebellion, and imprisoned in the Tower of London, the very place where her mother had been executed. She faced intense scrutiny and real danger. She learned to navigate suspicion and demonstrate loyalty, even when none was returned. These early experiences shaped her core philosophy: trust no one completely, never allow yourself to be beholden, and understand that love, especially romantic love, was a vulnerability that could be used against you. When Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1558 after Mary's death, England was fractured. The nation was in economic disarray, religiously divided, and diplomatically vulnerable. Elizabeth, a young woman of 25, understood that her reign would be tested not only by external threats but by internal expectations. Chief among these was the demand that she marries. Almost immediately, her council and parliament began pressing the matter. A queen needed a king, they insisted. A husband could protect her, provide her with heirs, and stabilize the realm. But Elizabeth would not be moved. Her refusal to marry was not due to a lack of suitors. She was courted by some of the most powerful men in Europe, including Philip II of Spain, who had previously been married to her half-sister Mary. Politically, a union with Spain could have ensured Catholic reconciliation and offered England some measure of protection against continental rivals. But Elizabeth knew the risks. Philip's influence could compromise her sovereignty, and her subjects, many of whom viewed Spain with suspicion and hostility, would not accept a foreign king with open arms. Elizabeth entertained the idea briefly, but ultimately rejected it. It was a pattern she would repeat with other suitors throughout her life. Among her more enduring and emotionally complex relationships was that with Robert Dudley, her childhood friend and favorite courtier. Rumors of their intimacy circulated widely. Dudley was married when their relationship deepened, and when his wife died under mysterious circumstances, speculation grew that Elizabeth might finally marry him. But despite their closeness and the personal affection she seemed to show him, Elizabeth never took that final step. To marry Dudley would have opened her up to scandal, court rivalries, and the possibility of diminishing her authority by elevating a court favorite to royal consort. Elizabeth turned every courtship into a political tool. By keeping the possibility of marriage alive, she kept foreign powers engaged without committing. It became a tactic of diplomacy, dangling her availability as a bargaining chip while retaining complete autonomy. She turned personal indecision into political advantage, allowing her to delay action, observe alliances, and keep England unaligned in a world of shifting powers. In doing so, she avoided the traps that had ensnared her predecessors. Mary I had married for alliance and paid a high political price. Elizabeth would not repeat the mistake. Her decision to remain single was framed as a gift to her country. She declared herself married to England, its married queen, promising that her people would be her family, her subjects her children. This image was carefully cultivated. Through court performances, public speeches, and symbolic art, she built a mythos around herself. The Virgin Queen became not just a personal identity, but a national ideology. It tied her purity to England's stability. It emphasized divine favor, suggesting that her choice to rule alone was preordained. Her virginity was recast as a badge of loyalty to her people, not a lack of romantic fulfillment. Under her rule, England entered what is often considered its golden age. It was a time of flourishing culture, maritime expansion, and relative internal peace. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 became the defining military triumph of her reign. Although England was not yet a global empire, the seeds of imperial ambition were planted. Commerce expanded, exploration surged, and the works of William Shakespeare and other literary giants gave the era its immortal voice. Elizabeth's court became a center of artistic, political, and intellectual activity. And through it all, she remained the unchallenged center of power. The mythologizing of Elizabeth I as the Virgin Queen became a powerful archetype in both her own time and in the centuries that followed. She was portrayed as a kind of secular Madonna, wise, chaste, commanding. She embodied a model of womanhood that did not rely on subservience or domesticity. Instead, her femininity was fused with majesty. This representation served her politically, allowing her to transcend the limitations imposed by gender norms. In an age when women were seen as inherently unfit to rule, she made her gender a strength, not a weakness. She was not pretending to be a man, she was inventing a new way of being a queen. However, this image came with its own pressures. Elizabeth was constantly scrutinized. She could not afford emotional vulnerability, missteps, or signs of fatigue. Her image had to remain carefully controlled. She used elaborate rituals, court masks, and finely staged public appearances to maintain the illusion of youth and strength. As she aged, the contradictions of her image grew harder to maintain. She wore heavy makeup to mask signs of age, and her political circle increasingly struggled to function without a clear successor. Her refusal to name an heir until the end of her life left England vulnerable to uncertainty, even if it helped preserve her authority while she lived. Despite these challenges, her legacy was solidified by the time of her death in 1603. She had ruled for 45 years, one of the longest reigns in English history up to that point. She had transformed herself from an insecure young woman marked by her mother's disgrace into one of the most celebrated monarchs of all time. More than that, she had proven that a woman could rule not just capably, but gloriously without a king at her side. She left no children, but her legacy was vast. She had laid the foundation for a nation that would soon dominate global affairs, and she had reshaped the very nature of queenship. Elizabeth's choice to remain unmarried has often been romanticized or pathologized by historians and writers. Some see her as a tragic figure denying herself love for the sake of duty. Others see her as a calculating politician, cold and emotionally reserved. But both readings simplify her. Her choice was neither purely emotional nor entirely strategic. It was a fusion of necessity, personal inclination, and visionary leadership. She knew the cost of marriage from history and from her own family. She had seen how love could weaken a ruler, and how political power could vanish in the wake of emotional entanglement. In choosing the crown over a consort, Elizabeth made a bold statement not just to her own people, but to all of history. She showed that leadership did not have to be borrowed from men. It could be crafted in a woman's own image, shaped by intellect, resilience, and performance. She redefined what it meant to be a queen, not a placeholder until a king arrived, but a ruler in full, commanding the loyalty and imagination of a nation. Her legacy lives on not just in the historical records of battles and policies, but in the archetype she created, the Virgin Queen, sovereign and singular, whose love belonged to her country alone. Cleopatra VII of Egypt is one of the most captivating figures in world history, remembered not only for her dramatic death and legendary lovers but also for her sharp political instincts and strategic brilliance. Her legacy is complicated, often distorted by Roman propaganda, romanticized by poets and filmmakers, and oversimplified in modern retellings. Yet behind the tales of seduction and glamour was a ruler navigating one of the most dangerous periods in Mediterranean politics. The last active pharaoh of Egypt, Cleopatra did not merely survive through beauty or charm. She ruled in a time of dynastic instability and imperial aggression, where every alliance could spell triumph or disaster. Her relationships with powerful Roman men, far from being simply tales of passion, were deeply embedded in the logic of power, survival, and statecraft. Cleopatra was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek royal family that had ruled Egypt since the time of Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy I. Although the Ptolemies had controlled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, their rule was increasingly precarious by the time Cleopatra ascended the throne. The family was notorious for its internal rivalries, with siblings frequently marrying, betraying, or even murdering one another to secure the throne. Cleopatra herself came to power at the age of 18, initially ruling jointly with her 10-year-old brother Ptolemy XIII, to whom she was also married according to dynastic custom. But their co-rule quickly devolved into civil conflict. By 48 BCE, Cleopatra had been forced to flee Alexandria, replaced by factions backing her brother. At this moment of crisis, Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt, pursuing his rival Pompey. Cleopatra understood that aligning with Caesar could provide her with the military and political backing necessary to reclaim her throne. According to tradition, she famously had herself smuggled into the palace wrapped in a rug to meet him. Whether or not this dramatic story is literally true, the essence remains. Cleopatra acted decisively to forge a strategic alliance with the most powerful Roman of the day. Their relationship produced a child, Caesar, and Caesar helped restore Cleopatra to the throne. However, this was no fairy tale romance. Cleopatra needed Roman support to stabilize her rule, and Caesar, seeking to establish Roman authority over Egypt, found in Cleopatra a loyal and capable local partner. Their bond was mutually beneficial, rooted as much in geopolitical calculation as in personal chemistry. Cleopatra joined Caesar in Rome for a period, a scandalous presence that enraged many Roman elites. But her purpose was clear: to solidify her son's position as a future ruler and to cement her alliance with Caesar as protector of her crown. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, Cleopatra was forced once again to reassess her position in a shifting political landscape. Back in Egypt, she quickly returned to the project of consolidating power, this time turning her attention to Rome's next strongman, Mark Antony. Antony, one of Caesar's former generals and a member of the Second Triumvirate, controlled the eastern provinces of the Roman Republic. Cleopatra invited him to Egypt, hosting him in her famously luxurious court in Alexandria. Ancient sources, especially Roman ones, describe this as the beginning of a grand and corrupting love affair. But this narrative, while titillating, masks the political sophistication behind Cleopatra's actions. For Cleopatra, Antony offered continuity. Like Caesar before him, he could protect her reign, bolster Egypt's autonomy under Roman influence, and secure her son's claims. In return, she offered Antony access to Egypt's vast wealth, grain, and naval resources. The alliance was deeply political. Together, they envisioned a new Eastern Empire, with Alexandria as a cultural and political counterweight to Rome. Their relationship produced 3 children and saw Cleopatra reach the height of her power, co-ruling with Antony over an empire that stretched from Syria to Cyrenaica. Despite this, their union was increasingly vilified in Rome. Octavian, later Augustus, Caesar's adopted heir and Antony's rival, weaponized the alliance in his bid for supremacy. Through an aggressive propaganda campaign, he cast Cleopatra as a dangerous foreign temptress who had seduced a once great Roman into abandoning his virtue, duties, and homeland. Antony was portrayed as weak and degenerate, enthralled by an exotic queen who sought to undermine Roman values and dominate through sexuality. These portrayals had less to do with truth and more with Roman anxieties about female power, Eastern culture, and the erosion of traditional masculinity. Cleopatra, in Roman literature, became a symbol of decadence, betrayal, and moral decline. This image stuck. In plays by Shakespeare and others, Cleopatra is remembered less as a skilled ruler and more as the tragic lover of Antony. But beneath the Roman distortion was a woman determined to hold her kingdom together in a world where Rome was swallowing every independent power in its reach. Cleopatra understood the stakes. Her relationship with Antony was a final bid to create an alternative to Roman hegemony. When the conflict between Octavian and Antony escalated into full civil war, Cleopatra supplied fleets, troops, and funds to Antony's cause. She was not a passive lover waiting in the wings. She was a co-commander in a war for the future of the Mediterranean. The war ended disastrously. At the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Antony and Cleopatra's forces were decisively defeated by Octavian's navy. They retreated to Egypt, where the last chapter of their lives unfolded. As Octavian advanced toward Alexandria, Antony committed suicide, misled into believing Cleopatra had already done so. In the days that followed, Cleopatra tried to negotiate with Octavian, possibly to preserve her children's lives and Egypt's nominal independence. But she knew the reality: Rome would not let her live. She had become too powerful, too iconic, and too threatening to be paraded as a token of submission. Her death, like much of her life, has been steeped in myth. According to legend, she allowed an asp, a venomous snake, to bite her, committing suicide in a final act of defiance. Whether she died this way or by poison is still debated, but the meaning remains. Cleopatra chose death on her own terms rather than become a trophy in Octavian's triumph. It was both personal and political. In a world where captured monarchs were humiliated in public processions, her suicide was the last act of sovereignty. Cleopatra's end sparked a new wave of myth-making. Octavian, now Augustus, encouraged narratives that emphasized her exoticism, her treachery, and her alleged manipulation of men. These portrayals served to justify Roman conquest and to delegitimize the idea of powerful female leadership. The reality of her reign was quite different. Cleopatra spoke multiple languages, restored Egypt's economy, enacted administrative reforms, and maintained internal stability for over 2 decades. She was the last of the Ptolemaic line to rule Egypt, and her death marked the formal end of Egyptian independence. Her son Caesarion was killed, and Egypt became a Roman province. Despite Roman efforts to degrade her memory, Cleopatra's legacy endured. She became a symbol of female power, both celebrated and feared. Later generations would reinterpret her through different lenses: the romantic heroine, the political manipulator, the tragic queen. But none of these archetypes can fully encompass her life. She was a monarch who used every tool available: diplomacy, cultural patronage, alliances, and yes, personal relationships to navigate the dangers of imperial politics. She refused to be passive, refused to be diminished, and refused to live under someone else's narrative. The relationships Cleopatra had with Caesar and Antony were not mere romances, they were extensions of her political strategy. In both cases, she aligned herself with the dominant Roman figures of the day to safeguard her rule and that of her children. The myth of Cleopatra as a seductress obscures the reality that she was deeply pragmatic and forward-thinking. Her power was not rooted in love, but in her command of symbols, her understanding of political theater, and her unwavering commitment to Egyptian sovereignty. Cleopatra was not the victim of love, but of a world that could not tolerate her strength. Her downfall was not due to romantic obsession but to the relentless expansion of Rome and the patriarchal narratives it used to justify conquest. She stands today not merely as a tragic figure from antiquity, but as a reminder that female power, when fully realized, often meets with distortion, resistance, and myth. Cleopatra refused to be written out of history. Instead, she made herself unforgettable ruler, strategist, mother, and sovereign to the very end. Wu Zetian's ascent to the pinnacle of Chinese imperial power is one of the most extraordinary stories in history. She remains the only woman in over 2 millennia to rule China in her own name as emperor, not as consort, empress dowager, or regent, but as the sovereign ruler of a dynasty she herself founded. Her journey from concubine to emperor was not only a masterclass in political strategy but also a sustained challenge to the patriarchal norms of Tang China. Every step she took was contested, every action scrutinized more harshly than that of her male counterparts. Yet she emerged, for a time, unassailable. Born in 624 CE to a relatively well-off aristocratic family, Wu Zhao, later Wu Zetian, received an unusually broad education for a girl of her time, including literacy in classical Chinese and a grounding in literature, politics, and history. Her intelligence and ambition were apparent early. At age 14, she was brought into the Tang court as a concubine of Emperor Taizong. She served in a minor role during his reign, never rising above the lower ranks of the imperial harem. When he died in 649, as was customary, she was sent to a Buddhist convent to live out the rest of her days in obscurity. This could have been the end of her story. But Wu's ambition and political acumen had no intention of fading quietly. She had caught the attention of Taizong's son, the new Emperor Gaozong, even before his father's death. Defying tradition, Gaozong brought her back to court and eventually installed her as his favorite consort. This scandalized many in the court, especially because Wu had been his father's concubine, considered a form of incest under Confucian ethics. But Wu navigated this opposition with cunning. She formed alliances, eliminated rivals, both politically and, according to some sources, physically, and used her intelligence and loyalty to Gaozong to consolidate her influence. One of her most controversial acts was the alleged murder of her own infant daughter, which she then blamed on the reigning empress, leading to the empress's removal and Wu's promotion to that position. As empress, Wu Zetian wielded power with increasing authority, especially as Gaozong's health declined. She presided over court affairs, appointed officials, and made critical policy decisions. After Gaozong's death, rather than step aside, she ruled first as Empress Dowager and regent for her sons, then eventually declared herself emperor in 690, establishing the short-lived Zhou dynasty, interrupting the Tang. This was unprecedented and radical. She adopted the male title, a role traditionally reserved for men, and established herself as not merely a regent, but as the rightful sovereign of China. Her ability to rise through such a deeply patriarchal system was rooted in a mix of political ruthlessness, intelligence, and an almost preternatural understanding of court dynamics. She promoted officials based on merit rather than family background, breaking the stronghold of traditional aristocratic power. She cultivated a bureaucracy that was loyal to her personally, often elevating individuals of humble origin. To suppress opposition, she used secret police and surveillance tactics, creating a network that could root out dissent and potential plots. These measures, while authoritarian, were not unusual by the standards of the time, but they were remembered with particular venom in her case, largely because of her gender. Wu Zetian's reforms were wide-ranging and in many respects progressive. She expanded the civil service examination system, providing greater access to government posts for those outside the hereditary elite. This not only increased administrative efficiency but also ensured that power was more broadly distributed, though always under her watchful eye. She invested heavily in agricultural infrastructure, improving irrigation and promoting grain storage policies to prevent famine. These actions enhanced her popularity among the rural population, even as the elite bristled at her unorthodox methods. Culturally, Wu Zetian understood the value of narrative and symbolism. She patronized Buddhism, partly to counter the Confucian establishment that was hostile to female rule. She declared herself the incarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha, thereby legitimizing her reign through spiritual authority. Under her patronage, Buddhist temples flourished, and art and literature received royal support. She also commissioned historical texts and inscriptions that emphasized her accomplishments and divine right to rule. In this way, she positioned herself not just as a political leader but as a moral and spiritual force. Wu Zetian's rule was undeniably effective. She brought relative stability to the empire during her tenure, reduced corruption, and ensured the continuity of the state at a time of transition. However, her consolidation of power was seen by many as ruthless. She exiled or executed a number of aristocrats and members of the imperial family who posed threats. Her use of informants and surveillance created an atmosphere of fear among the elite. While these measures kept her in power, they would later be used to discredit her legacy. After she was deposed in a palace coup in 705, just a year before her death, Confucian historians wasted no time in reshaping her story. These official chroniclers, steeped in a worldview where women were expected to be submissive and politically silent, cast her as a villainous usurper. She was accused of sexual promiscuity, cruelty, manipulation, and unnatural ambition. Many of these accusations, though unsubstantiated or exaggerated, became embedded in historical texts, shaping centuries of perception. Where male emperors might be described as decisive, she was called cruel. Where others were pragmatic, she was seen as scheming. This demonization served a broader ideological purpose: to reinforce the idea that female rule was dangerous, aberrant, and destabilizing. Wu Zetian became a cautionary tale, an example of what happens when women overstep their prescribed boundaries. Yet her reign, lasting more than 50 years in various capacities, was longer and in many respects, more effective than many of her male predecessors and successors. In recent decades, Wu Zetian's legacy has undergone significant re-evaluation, particularly by feminist scholars and modern historians who seek to disentangle fact from centuries of bias. They argue that her political decisions, far from being uniquely tyrannical, were consistent with the practices of her time and often more progressive. They point to her support for education, economic stability, and the arts as evidence of a ruler deeply invested in the welfare of her empire. Her use of Buddhist legitimacy is now seen not as opportunism but as a savvy adaptation to political necessity. Moreover, her rise through court politics is increasingly seen as a reflection of her exceptional capabilities rather than mere manipulation. Unlike many of her male counterparts, she had no formal path to power. Every inch she gained, she had to seize in defiance of societal norms, institutional barriers, and widespread prejudice. Her gender made her a target, and yet she succeeded in holding power longer than most Tang emperors. Wu Zetian's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how history is written and who gets to write it. Her life was one of relentless negotiation between ambition and limitation, strategy and survival, power and perception. She redefined what it meant to rule in a world that insisted she could not. And while her methods may have been controversial, her success cannot be denied. Wu Zetian was neither a mere schemer nor a misunderstood saint. She was a complex, visionary and forceful leader who knew how to manipulate the structures of power better than almost anyone of her time. Her reign is a testament to the possibilities and perils of female authority in a patriarchal world. She understood the cost of power, accepted it, and shaped history on her own terms. Today, her story is no longer a moral warning but a mirror held up to the systems that feared her, and a legacy reclaimed by those who see in her the courage to defy expectations and rule with vision. Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba, in what is now modern-day Angola, stands as one of the most remarkable and resilient female leaders in African history. Her life unfolded during one of the most brutal periods of early modern colonialism, marked by the violent expansion of European empires and the increasing entrenchment of the transatlantic slave trade. Unlike many leaders, male or female, who were overwhelmed or co-opted by European powers, Nzinga skillfully maneuvered between diplomacy, warfare and cultural adaptation to maintain sovereignty and protect her people. Her legacy is one of fierce resistance, political ingenuity, and a refusal to conform to the limiting roles imposed on women, especially under colonial duress. Nzinga was born around 1583 to the royal family of the Mbundu-speaking Kingdom of Ndongo. From an early age, she was trained in the arts of leadership, military strategy, and diplomacy. Her father, Ngola Kaluanji Kiasamba, ensured she received an education uncommon for women at the time, recognizing her intelligence and political potential. This early exposure to statecraft would serve her well, especially as the Portuguese began expanding their presence along the West African coast. By the early 17th century, the Portuguese were exerting increasing pressure on Ndongo, seeking access to slaves and resources while undermining local governance. Nzinga first rose to prominence in 1622 when her brother, King Bandi, sent her as his envoy to negotiate peace with the Portuguese. This mission became a defining moment in her life and a demonstration of her diplomatic brilliance. At the negotiations in Luanda, Nzinga met with Portuguese Governor João Correia de Sousa. Realizing the meeting had been arranged to subtly degrade her, there was no chair for her. While the governor sat on a throne, Nzinga ordered one of her attendants to kneel, forming a human chair so she could meet her counterpart at eye level. This act, bold and symbolic, communicated a refusal to be seen as inferior and established her as an equal player in high-stakes diplomacy. Nzinga successfully negotiated a temporary peace and secured some measure of Portuguese withdrawal, along with promises to stop supporting rival African factions. As part of the strategy, she converted to Christianity and adopted the name Dona Ana de Souza, signaling political flexibility rather than religious submission. Her conversion was a diplomatic tool to curry favor with the Portuguese crown, not a renunciation of her identity. She understood that aligning herself even superficially with European norms could serve as a protective shield for her kingdom. This was not submission but adaptation for survival. But the truce was short-lived. The Portuguese violated their agreements, resuming slave raids and allying with hostile local forces to weaken Ndongo. Nzinga's brother died shortly after, likely by suicide, leaving a crisis of succession. While female rule was not entirely foreign in Central African traditions, it was still controversial. Nzinga, seizing the opportunity, claimed the throne and began consolidating her power. She faced internal resistance from male rivals and external aggression from the Portuguese. Her response was to reframe herself entirely, not just as a female ruler, but as a warrior king in the masculine mode. Rejecting traditional gender roles, Nzinga adopted male military regalia, led troops into battle, and insisted on being addressed with male titles. This gender presentation was not mere performance but a radical political assertion in a patriarchal context. She needed to embody authority in a way that her people and enemies would recognize as legitimate, and she did so by transcending gendered expectations. Her masculine presentation helped solidify her position, particularly in a time when military strength was equated with political legitimacy. More striking still was her rejection of marriage as a political or personal obligation. In contrast to the diplomatic norm of marrying to secure alliances, Nzinga chose autonomy. She never married, and instead surrounded herself with a court that included male concubines dressed as women, another dramatic inversion of gendered power structures. These choices were not mere eccentricities but deliberate strategies. By avoiding marriage, she avoided political entanglements and ensured that no man could claim authority over her through marital ties. Her sexuality, like her diplomacy and military strategy, was wielded as a tool of sovereignty. Nzinga also built alliances with neighboring kingdoms and refugee communities, including bands of runaway slaves, disaffected warriors, and political exiles. These groups found in her leadership not only a means of survival but a vision of resistance. She moved her base to the kingdom of Matamba, which became a stronghold for her military campaigns and a refuge for those fleeing Portuguese oppression. There, she re-established a functioning and independent state, launching raids, ambushes, and counterattacks against the Portuguese and their allies for decades. Her guerrilla warfare tactics were highly effective. She leveraged the terrain, used intelligence networks, and conducted surprise attacks that kept Portuguese forces destabilized. She also maintained diplomatic pressure, occasionally offering to negotiate or sign truces when it served her purposes, only to resume hostilities when betrayed or when the balance of power shifted. Her resilience over decades of conflict earned her a reputation not just as a local ruler, but as a continental symbol of anti-colonial resistance. Nzinga's reign extended for more than 37 years, an astonishing feat given the colonial pressures and internal challenges she faced. She ruled until her death in 1663, maintaining political control, cultural authority, and a strong military presence throughout her life. By the time of her death, she had managed to preserve a significant degree of sovereignty for Matamba, even as Portuguese influence grew in the region. Her leadership ensured that the full annexation of her territory was delayed for nearly a century after her death. The legacy of Nzinga extends far beyond her lifetime. She has become a national heroine in Angola, celebrated in literature, oral traditions, and public monuments. Her image graces currency, and her story is taught as a symbol of resistance, pride, and African resilience. For modern African feminists and anti-colonial thinkers, Nzinga represents the possibility of agency even under overwhelming pressure. She is remembered not as a queen who loved or served for peace at any cost, but as one who fought and schemed to ensure her people's survival and dignity. Yet her story is also a challenge to the Eurocentric narratives of African history that too often paint the continent as passive or helpless in the face of European colonization. Nzinga's strategies, her mastery of diplomacy, manipulation of gender norms, military command, and coalition building demonstrate a level of political sophistication equal to that of any European contemporary. She was not just a warrior queen, she was a state builder, a defender of her people's independence, and a leader whose policies were rooted in both pragmatism and vision. Today, Queen Nzinga is recognized not just within Africa, but globally as a symbol of uncompromising leadership. Her decision to reject marriage, wield power in a male-dominated world, and maintain her independence speaks to a broader theme found across history. When women are freed from the narrow confines of being wives, lovers, or symbols, they can become architects of power. Nzinga did not merely survive in the colonial world, she defied it, resisted it, and carved out space for her people in defiance of its structures. Her refusal to be defined by love, marriage, or gender expectations placed her firmly in the tradition of women who chose power not out of coldness, but out of necessity, agency, and strategy. Her life is a reminder that for many women in history, the choice was never truly between love and power. It was about survival, sovereignty, and the shaping of legacy in a hostile world. Queen Nzinga chose power, and in doing so, she left behind a legend that continues to inspire centuries later. Catherine the Great of Russia, born Princess Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, is one of the most formidable women to ever rule a major empire. Her journey from a minor German princess to Empress of Russia was marked by calculated strategy, intellectual ambition, and a fierce commitment to power. Catherine's reign, spanning from 1762 until her death in 1796, was not only one of Russia's most expansive in terms of territorial conquest but also one of its most culturally transformative. Her path to the throne and her legacy demonstrates how a woman could wield immense authority without conforming to traditional roles of marriage or romantic submission, challenging both contemporary and historical expectations of female leadership. Her story begins with a dynastic marriage to the future Peter III of Russia, an awkward and politically disastrous match arranged to consolidate ties between German principalities and the Russian crown. Catherine arrived in Russia at age 14, a young and idealistic girl eager to assimilate into her new homeland. She learned the Russian language, converted to Orthodox Christianity, and threw herself into studying Russian culture, politics, and philosophy. Over time, she realized that her husband, Peter, was deeply unpopular among the nobility and ill-suited for rule. He was eccentric, immature, and openly admired Prussia, Russia's rival, alienating many factions at court. Catherine, by contrast, cultivated an image of dignity, intelligence, and devotion to Russia. She surrounded herself with powerful allies among the military and nobility, subtly preparing for a moment of political transformation. When Peter III ascended to the throne in 1762, his reign lasted only 6 months. His erratic policies and alignment with Frederick the Great made him widely despised. Sensing the opportunity, Catherine conspired with key military leaders, including her lover Grigory Orlov, to stage a coup. The takeover was swift. Catherine declared herself sole ruler with the backing of the Imperial Guard. Peter was arrested and died shortly after under suspicious circumstances, likely murdered by her supporters. Catherine's seizure of power was not merely a domestic palace intrigue, it was a sophisticated assertion of authority by a woman in a male-dominated autocracy. She justified her reign through both Enlightenment rhetoric and Russian Orthodox tradition, claiming she acted for the good of the state. Her coup d'état set the stage for a reign that would blend autocratic rule with Enlightenment ideals in ways that reshaped the Russian Empire. Catherine's approach to love and sexuality further underscores her radical departure from expected norms. Though her early marriage was political, emotionally unfulfilling, and strategically useless, she never remarried after becoming empress. Instead, she cultivated a series of personal relationships with lovers who were, at times, influential political figures, military officers, and even young protégés. Some of these men were given positions of power, others faded quickly from favor. But Catherine always ensured that her personal liaisons did not interfere with her governance or decision-making. Her ability to compartmentalize her private desires and public responsibilities was extraordinary. Unlike many queens or empresses who were expected to remarry to secure alliances or produce heirs, Catherine chose independence. She already had a son Paul who was technically her heir, though many believed him to be fathered not by Peter III but by her lover, Sergei Saltykov. Catherine made clear that she had no intention of subordinating herself to another man. Her lovers were companions, advisors, and sometimes distractions, but never equals in power. This separation of intimacy from statecraft was deliberate and revolutionary in a time when royal women were often tools in dynastic marriage markets. This personal autonomy extended to her ideological convictions. Catherine was a voracious reader and corresponded with major figures of the European Enlightenment, including Voltaire, Diderot, and Montesquieu. She admired their writings on reason, governance, and education, and sought to bring Enlightenment principles to Russia, even as she ruled as an absolute monarch. Her reign was marked by attempts at legal reform, modernizing the administration, and expanding educational opportunities, especially for the nobility. She commissioned a new legal code, the Nakaz, which drew on Montesquieu's ideas and promoted equality under the law, although many of its ideals were never fully implemented due to resistance from the aristocracy. Catherine's understanding of power extended beyond theory. She was also a master of statecraft. She expanded the Russian Empire significantly, annexing Crimea, parts of Poland, and territories along the Black Sea. These conquests strengthened Russia's geopolitical standing and secured its access to warm-water ports, a long-standing strategic goal. Her military campaigns were often carried out by trusted generals such as Potemkin, who was also one of her most influential lovers. Under her leadership, Russia emerged as a dominant force in European politics. Simultaneously, Catherine poured resources into the cultural and intellectual life of the empire. She founded schools, libraries, and the Smolny Institute, the first state-funded higher education institution for women in Russia. She promoted the arts, collected paintings and classical antiquities, and transformed the Hermitage into one of the greatest museums in the world. Her patronage extended to architecture, theater, and science, and she encouraged the translation of European works into Russian to foster a literate and politically aware elite. In doing so, she cultivated a court that was not just powerful, but cosmopolitan and intellectually vibrant. Yet Catherine's reign was not without contradiction. While she espoused Enlightenment ideals, she also upheld serfdom, which bound millions of peasants in brutal hereditary labor. Though she considered limited reforms, she ultimately relied on the nobility's support to maintain her rule, and thus preserved their privileges. After the Pugachev rebellion in the 1770, an uprising led by a Cossack claiming to be her dead husband, she became more conservative, retreating from liberal reforms and emphasizing state control. Still, she continued to expand and modernize the empire, balancing idealism with pragmatism. The public narratives surrounding Catherine have long been shaped by both admiration and scandal. Historians, especially Western ones, often fixated on her private life, exaggerating her romantic exploits to distract from her political genius. Myths about her sexuality, some entirely fabricated and grotesquely misogynistic, served to undermine her credibility as a ruler. These stories reflect more about the discomfort with powerful women than with Catherine herself. Male rulers were rarely judged by their romantic lives. Catherine was defined by hers in the historical imagination. But these caricatures obscure the essential truth. She ruled with authority, vision, and confidence for over 3 decades, shaping one of the world's largest empires. Catherine's decision never to remarry and to instead rule alone was central to her autonomy. She recognized that any husband would either threaten her authority or become a symbolic challenge to her sovereignty. By refusing that route, she modeled a form of power that was not reliant on romantic validation or dynastic compromise. Her lovers may have come and gone, but the throne and the immense control it afforded was hers alone. Her death in 1796 marked the end of an era. She left behind a Russian empire vastly larger, more centralized, and more culturally refined than the one she inherited. Her grandson Alexander I would carry some of her legacy forward, but few could match the intensity and breadth of her ambitions. Catherine redefined what it meant to be a female monarch in the modern age. Her reign challenged the assumption that power had to be tempered by modesty, or that love had to be prioritized over legacy. In many ways, Catherine's life encapsulates the central tension faced by powerful women throughout history: the expectation to be emotionally accessible and self-sacrificing versus the necessity to be authoritative and independent. Catherine chose the latter, but without entirely giving up the former. She demonstrated that a woman could have lovers without being ruled by them, could lead an empire without a king, and could reshape the cultural landscape of a nation without ever becoming someone's wife. Her life is not simply one of conquest or scandal, but of intentional self-definition. She chose how to rule, how to love, and how to be remembered. While many queens were remembered for whom they married, whom they bore children with, or whom they mourned, Catherine the Great is remembered for what she built, what she conquered, and what she envisioned. She was a ruler who chose power not as a substitute for love, but as its own legitimate pursuit, and in doing so, she became a symbol of what women could achieve when they refused to be constrained by the choices history tried to impose. Queen Nzinga of Silla, who ruled from 632 to 647 CE, stands as one of the earliest and most remarkable female sovereigns in East Asian history. Her reign over the Korean kingdom of Silla was distinguished not by grand displays of military might or dramatic courtly intrigues, but by a subtle and strategic use of culture, religion, and wisdom to consolidate authority. In an era when patriarchal norms were deeply entrenched and women were largely excluded from formal political power, Queen Nzinga emerged as a deft and innovative leader. She ruled not as a consort or regent, but as the sovereign monarch, and her decisions reveal a clear prioritization of statecraft and legacy over personal romance or dynastic marriage. Nzinga ascended the throne in a time of both internal factionalism and external threats. Silla was one of the 3 kingdoms of Korea, engaged in ongoing struggles with its neighbors Goguryeo and Baekje. She was born into royalty, the daughter of King Jinyoung, and showed remarkable intellect and foresight even as a princess. Given the absence of male heirs, her father designated her as his successor, a controversial decision that challenged the gender expectations of the time. Many aristocrats resisted the notion of a female ruler, fearing weakness or divine disapproval. But Nzinga, well-versed in Buddhist teachings, Confucian classics, and even celestial observation, used her education to assert not only her capability but her divine mandate. A key strategy in Nzinga's consolidation of power was her embrace of religious and astronomical symbolism. She portrayed herself as a ruler in tune with the cosmos, aligning her legitimacy with the divine order. This was crucial in a society where cosmic harmony was believed to reflect the rightness of a ruler. By commissioning temples, promoting Buddhism, and using astrology in state matters, she framed her authority as both enlightened and predestined. One notable example was her construction of Keomseongdi, the oldest surviving astronomical observatory in East Asia. Though a scientific instrument, its deeper purpose was political. It demonstrated her intelligence and claimed heavenly sanction. Buddhism became one of her most effective tools of rule. Not only did it provide a shared spiritual identity for her people, it also offered a framework that was relatively more inclusive of women in positions of spiritual and, by extension, temporal authority. By promoting Buddhist scholars, building pagodas, and supporting monastic institutions, Nzinga tied her reign to the promise of karmic virtue and moral leadership. Religion thus became both a personal conviction and a political mechanism. It allowed her to challenge Confucian ideals that prioritized patriarchal succession by presenting herself as a bodhisattva-like figure, wise, benevolent, and divinely guided. Her reign was not solely symbolic, however. Siandik implemented a number of practical reforms aimed at strengthening her kingdom. She focused heavily on infrastructure and education, recognizing that durable power required internal stability. She improved roads, sponsored irrigation projects to enhance agriculture, and expanded granaries to guard against famine. Such measures directly improved the livelihoods of her subjects and cemented her popularity. Education and merit were also promoted during her reign. She encouraged the training of young elites, especially in Buddhist and Confucian texts, and placed a premium on scholarly achievement. By raising the intellectual standards of her bureaucracy and broadening the influence of educated ministers over hereditary nobles, she subtly shifted power away from the aristocracy toward a more loyal and meritocratic court. These shifts helped prepare the groundwork for later unification efforts and made Silla more cohesive during a time when internal division could have proved disastrous. One of Siandik's longer-term visions was the unification of the Korean peninsula, an aspiration realized after her death but seeded during her reign. She forged stronger alliances with Tang China and laid diplomatic groundwork that would benefit her successors. While she didn't live to see the military campaigns that completed unification, she was instrumental in shaping the ideological and logistical conditions necessary for it. Her investments in cultural prestige and diplomatic outreach gave Silla a stable platform to engage with more powerful neighbors and prepare for future expansion. Perhaps the most radical aspect of Siandik's reign was her deliberate rejection of marriage. Unlike other queens or princesses in East Asia, who were often married off to cement political alliances, Siandik never took a husband. This was a highly unusual and politically significant decision. In many monarchies, especially in Confucian contexts, female rulers were expected to marry in order to stabilize their reigns and produce heirs. Siandik defied this expectation, choosing to reign alone. There's no evidence of any romantic entanglements during her reign, nor of any political maneuvering through personal relationships. Instead, her partnerships were symbolic or institutional. She aligned herself with monks, scholars, and court advisors, but never ceded control to a consort. This autonomy allowed her to rule without interference and ensured that no male figure could undermine her authority by claiming influence through marriage. In essence, she separated the institution of monarchy from the personal expectations of womanhood, claiming a space in politics that was wholly her own. Her unmarried status also emphasized that her rule was for the state, not for a family lineage. This was important in a society where monarchs were often judged based on their ability to produce male heirs. By opting out of this reproductive narrative, she invited a re-evaluation of what made a monarch legitimate. Her right to rule came not from her womb but from her wisdom, her vision, and her connection to the divine. Critically, her rejection of marriage was not portrayed as an emotional void but rather as a deliberate, strategic decision. It allowed her to focus entirely on governance, reform, and legacy. Her lack of a consort or children also made succession more complicated, but that too became part of her broader strategy. She designated successors based on loyalty and capability, not bloodline alone. This helped shift the political culture toward a more administrative form of monarchy, rather than purely dynastic. Queen Siandik's reign lasted only 15 years, but its impact reverberated for generations. She set precedents for female leadership, emphasized wisdom and cultural sophistication over brute force, and demonstrated that a ruler could be revered not for whom they married, but for what they built. In Korean history, she remains a figure of quiet strength, her legacy carried not by scandal or conquest, but by foresight, cultural depth, and spiritual authority. While history often glorifies rulers who took the throne with swords or married for power, Siandik's example stands in sharp contrast. She chose a subtler path, one of reform, religion, and resistance to gender norms. She left behind no tales of forbidden romance or tragic love, but instead, a kingdom that was more unified, more literate, and more culturally rich than it had been before. In choosing legacy over love, Queen Siandik redefined what it meant to be a woman in power and did so with brilliance, serenity, and unshakable intent. Mary, Queen of Scots, provides one of history's most vivid counterpoints to the narrative of female rulers choosing power over love. Her story is not just tragic, but emblematic of what happens when a monarch, especially a female one, prioritizes romance in a political landscape that punishes such vulnerability. In stark contrast to her cousin Elizabeth I, Mary's decisions to marry for love, or perhaps for passion and alliance without sufficient political calculation, led to her downfall. Where Elizabeth wielded her single status as a diplomatic tool and a symbol of independence, Mary's romantic entanglements rendered her vulnerable to factionalism, scandal, and ultimately imprisonment and death. Mary's first marriage to Francis II of France seemed strategically sound. It united Scotland and France under a powerful Catholic alliance. However, his early death left her a teenage widow, returning to a volatile Scottish court that was rife with Protestant-Catholic tension and noble rivalry. Rather than use her widowhood as a moment of political recalibration, Mary's subsequent marriages only deepened her political problems. Her second marriage to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was driven partly by dynastic considerations. He, like Mary, had Tudor blood and thus strengthened her claim to the English throne. But Darnley's ambition, arrogance, and instability quickly made the union a disaster. He was jealous of Mary's power and position, and within a year he had become not just a political liability but a personal threat. His suspected role in the murder of Mary's confidant, David Rizzio, inside the Queen's private chambers, sent shockwaves through her court. His own mysterious murder a year later, and Mary's hasty marriage to James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, widely believed to be Darnley's killer, turned public opinion sharply against her. The union with Bothwell, whether it was coerced or voluntary, sealed her fate. Seen as scandalous and illegitimate, it triggered a rebellion. Mary was imprisoned, forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, and eventually fled to England seeking protection from Elizabeth. Instead of sanctuary, she received nearly 2 decades of house arrest, culminating in her execution for alleged involvement in plots to assassinate Elizabeth. Her love life, filled with personal drama and political miscalculations, consistently undermined her authority and reputation. While Mary may have loved deeply or acted in pursuit of passionate alliances, the result was a narrative in which love and her susceptibility to it was portrayed as her undoing. Anne Boleyn's story, while different in scope and outcome, also reveals the complex and perilous relationship between ambition, love, and power. As the second wife of Henry VIII and mother of Elizabeth I, Anne occupies a unique space in the historical imagination. She is alternately cast as a cunning seductress who manipulated the king to rise from lady-in-waiting to queen, or as a tragic figure, caught in a web of political and emotional forces far beyond her control. Her relationship with Henry VIII began while he was still married to Catherine of Aragon. Unlike previous mistresses, Anne refused to become his lover without a formal commitment. This resistance only increased Henry's obsession and led him to pursue the annulment of his first marriage, sparking the English Reformation and England's break from the Catholic Church. In this sense, Anne wielded immense influence not just over Henry's personal life, but over the very fabric of English governance and religious life. Yet Anne's elevation was always precarious. Her inability to produce a male heir eroded her favor with Henry, and her assertive personality alienated many at court. Accused of adultery, incest, and treason, charges likely fabricated by her political enemies, and was executed in 1536. Her fall underscores how quickly ambition could be reframed as promiscuity, how easily confidence in a woman could be construed as arrogance or threat. And may have believed she could balance love and power, or perhaps she misjudged Henry's capacity for loyalty. Regardless, her fate shows the impossibility of navigating court politics as a woman without becoming the subject of suspicion and slander. Her love for Henry, if love it was, proved fatal. Yet through her daughter Elizabeth, Anne's legacy endured, ironically fulfilling her highest ambition not through romance, but through motherhood and the lineage of power. Considering these stories through the lens of roads not taken, invites a compelling thought experiment. What might have happened if Mary, Queen of Scots, had chosen not to remarry after Darnley's death? Could she have, like Elizabeth, ruled alone and reasserted her authority through political alliances rather than romantic ones? Perhaps she might have retained the throne of Scotland, even claimed England, and changed the course of European Protestantism. What if Anne Boleyn had declined Henry's pursuit, remained abroad, or aligned herself with more stable power structures within the English court? Could she have lived longer, wielded her wit and intelligence from behind the scenes, and still ensured Elizabeth's birth and ascent? These counterfactuals do not suggest that women should avoid love or that romantic partnerships inherently weaken female rulers. Rather, they highlight the treacherous double standards imposed on women in power. Romantic entanglements were often scrutinized more harshly when the subject was a woman, and mistakes in love were interpreted as political incompetence. Men could pursue marriages of convenience or take mistresses without their legitimacy being questioned. For queens, the same actions were painted as immoral, naive, or destructive. By exploring these roads not taken, we gain a deeper understanding of how narrow the paths to secure female rule were in male-dominated societies. Every choice carried outsized consequences. For women like Mary and Anne, love and ambition existed on a tightrope. One misstep could lead to ruin. If they had made different choices, perhaps they could have escaped scandal or preserved power longer. But it is just as possible that the structural forces aligned against them, patriarchy, religious politics, dynastic rivalry, would have ensured their downfall no matter the strategy. These hypothetical revisions also illuminate how rare and calculated the choices of queens like Elizabeth I, Catherine the Great, and Nzinga truly were. Their refusal to marry was not simply a matter of personal preference, but a radical political strategy. It was an active rejection of systems that sought to control them through intimate relationships. For many of history's queens, love was not a luxury, it was a potential liability. Choosing power, then, was not a cold dismissal of emotion, but a measured act of resistance. In examining the lives of women who fell from power through romantic choices, and imagining how things might have gone differently, we don't merely indulge in historical fantasy. We reflect on the rigid confines within which women had to operate and the extraordinary risks they faced for choosing either love or power. Their lives serve as both cautionary tales and case studies in the politics of gender and agency. The roads not taken were often blocked before they could even be chosen, and yet, within those constraints, some still managed to shape history even through tragedy. Throughout history, queens who chose power over love have not simply resisted societal expectations, they have redefined the feminine archetypes traditionally used to constrain them. The roles of the virgin, the widow, and the warrior have long been assigned to women in literature, religion, and myth, often representing purity, mourning, or strength as mutually exclusive qualities. But when real women ascended to thrones, governed empires, and refused to be defined by their relationships to men, they complicated and reshaped these classical tropes into something more nuanced and strategic. The Virgin Queen, most famously embodied by Elizabeth I, turned chastity from a passive symbol of purity into a weaponized political stance. She used her virginity to maintain diplomatic flexibility, never tethering herself to a foreign alliance through marriage. This allowed her to play suitors and kingdoms against each other, maintaining England's sovereignty and her own autonomy. The trope of the Virgin, once defined by innocence or even submission, became a declaration of self-sufficiency and authority. Elizabeth's image was cultivated not only as a woman above romantic entanglement, but as a quasi-divine ruler married to her people and her nation. The widow archetype, often associated with loss and melancholy, found new expression in rulers like Catherine de' Medici or even Mary, Queen of Scots, who navigated politics as bereaved women. These queens used widowhood to assert legitimacy and navigate male-dominated courts, cloaking their strategic maneuvering in the acceptable guise of mourning. Rather than being rendered powerless by grief, they adapted the societal respect afforded to widows into a shield for political action. Meanwhile, the warrior queen trope was fully embraced by figures like Queen Nzinga or Boudica. They disrupted expectations of female gentleness and passivity, not only leading armies but adopting masculine appearances and behaviors to assert dominance. However, their aggression was not about imitating male rulers, it was about survival and sovereignty. The archetype of the warrior thus became not a departure from femininity but a reinvention of it, bold, confrontational, and unyielding. Central to this reimagining of archetypes is the tension between sacrifice and strategy. The common narrative frames these queens' rejection of marriage and romantic love as cold or emotionally deficient, suggesting that to choose power is to give up some essential piece of femininity. But such interpretations misunderstand the depth of their choices. For many of these rulers, the decision was not a sacrifice of love in the abstract, but a refusal to submit to the political vulnerabilities that often came with romantic entanglement. Marriage for queens was rarely a private matter. It came loaded with expectations of alliance, inheritance, submission, and sometimes foreign domination. Choosing not to marry or not to remarry was often a form of strategic self-preservation. Elizabeth I recognized that any husband would come with competing loyalties and could undermine her authority. Wu Zetian, after securing power, did not position herself beside a husband but ruled alone, reshaping court structures to centralize herself as the ultimate authority. Catherine the Great took lovers but never again a husband, clearly distinguishing between private pleasure and political compromise. These were not decisions made in emotional vacuum, but with clear-eyed understanding of the cost of sharing power in a world that rarely accepted female sovereignty. Even queens who did marry often did so with calculated intention. Some used marriage to secure claims or placate factions, but those who maintained their power knew how to keep that union from overshadowing their rule. Others, like Queen Nzinga, avoided it altogether, presenting spiritual or symbolic legitimacy in place of dynastic continuation. What from the outside might seem a lonely path was in reality an assertion of autonomy. Their choices challenged the notion that femininity must be expressed through partnership, suggesting instead that identity, fulfillment, and legacy could be achieved through governance, intellect, and vision. The resonance of these redefined archetypes extends far beyond history. In modern politics, media, and leadership, echoes of the virgin, the widow, and the warrior continue to shape how powerful women are seen and how they present themselves. Leaders like Angela Merkel, often referred to as mother despite having no children, wielded moral authority that transcended traditional gender roles. She, like many women in leadership today, did not frame her career as a personal sacrifice but as a purposeful life path. Figures such as Hillary Clinton or Jacinda Ardern have also navigated public expectations of femininity in power, balancing strength, compassion, motherhood, and intellect. Even in fictional portrayals such as Daenerys Targaryen from Game of Thrones or Wonder Woman in modern film, the warrior queen archetype has re-emerged as both empowering and complex, complete with flaws, agency, and emotional depth. Media and pop culture often grapple with these archetypes, sometimes reinforcing them, other times subverting them. The single, childless female leader is still frequently portrayed as either tragic or secretly yearning for love. Yet, audiences increasingly recognize that independence and emotional richness are not mutually exclusive. The archetypes now evolve with the characters, just as real-life queens once evolved them through necessity. Ultimately, the stories of queens who chose power do more than defy romantic idealism. They expand the definition of womanhood itself. They demonstrate that love, while powerful, is not the only path to fulfillment or influence. They show that femininity can encompass strategy, intellect, ambition, and legacy. And they remind us that choosing power is not a denial of emotion, but often a deeper engagement with responsibility. These historical figures forced their societies to consider new possibilities for female leadership. They did not fit comfortably into the roles carved out for them by myth or tradition but instead reshaped those roles, layering them with new meaning. As women continue to rise in global leadership, business, and culture, the echoes of the virgin, the widow, and the warrior, now reimagined and reclaimed, continue to resonate, inspiring new generations to define power on their own terms. In the contemporary political landscape, echoes of historical queens who chose power over love can be seen in the lives of modern women leaders. While today's context is markedly different with expanded rights, democratic institutions, and more visibility for women in leadership, the underlying tensions between personal relationships and public power persist. Female heads of state are still measured not only by their policies or leadership style but also by how they navigate or appear to navigate love, family, and femininity. Angela Merkel, former Chancellor of Germany, exemplifies the modern reimagining of the politically independent female leader. Though married, her personal life remained completely separate from her public persona throughout her long tenure. She rarely spoke about her husband, and the media generally respected that boundary. Merkel's style was pragmatic, restrained, and deliberately asexual in its public presentation. Much like historical queens who refused to marry to avoid foreign influence or power dilution, Merkel kept her personal sphere private to ensure that her authority remained uncontested and self-contained. Her leadership was characterized by calm resolve and intellectual rigor rather than charisma or relational performance, reinforcing a model of female power that does not require romantic validation. Jacinda Ardern, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, represents a different but equally compelling version of modern female leadership. She openly embraced motherhood while in office, giving birth during her term, a global first among contemporary elected heads of government. Yet, she notably did not marry her partner while in office, despite public speculation. Her relationship remained stable and supportive, but she made a clear distinction between her domestic life and her role as Prime Minister. In doing so, she subverted the traditional narrative that a woman must either be a career-driven singleton or a full-time caregiver. Ardern's leadership style, characterized by empathy and clear communication, showed that choosing both love and power could be possible but on her terms, not according to public expectation. Michelle Bachelet, Chile's first female president, also modeled a life that distinguished between personal and public roles. Twice elected to lead her country, Bachelet was a divorced single mother who never remarried. Her political identity was deeply influenced by personal tragedy. Her father was tortured and killed under Pinochet's regime, but she never allowed romantic relationships to define her public image. Her leadership was shaped more by ideals of social justice and healthcare reform than by any perceived need to fit into a traditional feminine mold. Like historical queens who forged their legacies through resilience rather than romance, Bachelet demonstrated that female power does not have to follow patriarchal scripts. Despite the progress made by women like Merkel, Ardern, and Bachelet, media framing of female power remains entangled with outdated expectations. Women in leadership are still regularly asked about how they balance work and family, a question rarely posed to their male counterparts. Their appearance, marital status, reproductive choices, and emotional demeanor are all subject to intense scrutiny. This reflects an enduring societal fixation with how women express femininity even when occupying positions of ultimate authority. In popular coverage, there is often an undertone that women must have it all: a successful career, a romantic partner, and ideally children to be truly admired. When women choose not to marry or have children, media narratives often portray them as either emotionally incomplete or secretly regretful. This mirrors how historical queens were often accused of being cold or unfeminine when they chose sovereignty over domesticity. Even today, the trope of the ice queen persists in commentary on female politicians who do not visibly demonstrate warmth or relational softness. Additionally, when women in power do show emotion or discuss their families, media tends to focus more on those aspects than their policy achievements. Ardern's decision to resign in 2023, for instance, was interpreted by some not just as political fatigue but as a consequence of motherhood or emotional vulnerability, despite her clear statements to the contrary. The underlying implication is that personal life and leadership capacity are intrinsically linked for women, while male politicians rarely face such associations. These dynamics don't just affect real-world perceptions, they bleed into fictional representations and cultural storytelling. Modern television, film, and literature increasingly reflect the complexities of women who wield power, often drawing directly or indirectly from historical examples. Characters like Olivia Pope in Scandal, Claire Underwood in House of Cards, or Daenerys Targaryen in Game of Thrones reflect an evolving archetype: women who are both powerful and conflicted, romantic yet calculating, maternal yet ruthless. In film, female leaders are often framed through the tension between their public responsibilities and private desires. The question is rarely whether they are competent, but whether their power makes them lonely, hard, or emotionally distant. This trope plays on centuries-old fears about women who step beyond traditional roles, echoing how queens like Wu Zetian or Elizabeth I were portrayed as sacrificing their womanhood in exchange for power. Yet, cultural narratives are shifting. In recent years, audiences have shown growing interest in stories where female leaders are not punished for their ambition or independence. There is a broader appetite for nuanced portrayals that acknowledge the strategic nature of personal choices in leadership, rather than reducing them to melodrama. Films like The Favourite or Mary Queen of Scots offer layered, often ambiguous interpretations of historical women and their power struggles, inviting viewers to question traditional dichotomies between love and rule. In leadership theory and organizational studies, these shifts are beginning to inform practical understanding as well. Scholars and executives are examining how gendered expectations affect leadership styles, communication, and authority. The stereotype of the nurturing female boss is slowly giving way to a recognition that leadership can be assertive, directive, or collaborative regardless of gender. Female leaders who present as unapologetically powerful whether or not they engage publicly with love or family are starting to reshape the archetype of what leadership looks like. These contemporary echoes remind us that the stories of historical queens who chose power over love are not merely relics of the past. They are part of a living continuum in which women constantly navigate societal expectations, institutional power, and personal autonomy. The decisions of today's female leaders, whether to marry, have children, show emotion, or remain single, are still read through lenses shaped by centuries of scrutiny. But increasingly, these women are crafting their own narratives, rooted not in sacrifice, but in strategy, principle, and purpose. In that sense, the legacies of queens like Elizabeth I, Cleopatra, Wu Zetian, and Nzinga live on not just in history books, but in cabinet rooms, parliaments, and media across the globe. The tension between love and power remains, but it is being renegotiated with every generation. The archetypes endure, but they are no longer fixed. They are tools in the hands of women who are reshaping leadership on their own terms. Across centuries, continents, and cultures, the recurring story of queens who chose power over love is not merely a tale of personal sacrifice, but one of transformation, both of themselves and the very societies they ruled. From Elizabeth I's famously celibate reign to Cleopatra's calculated alliances, from Wu Zetian's rise from concubinage to emperorship to Queen Nzinga's militant defiance of colonial domination, these women navigated a world where power and love were often constructed as mutually exclusive for female rulers. And yet, what emerges from their stories is not simply the rejection of love, but a redefinition of it on their own terms. These sovereigns operated in patriarchal systems that rarely allowed a woman to rule without scrutiny, suspicion, or limitation. In most cases, marriage was not a romantic union but a political liability. For queens, marrying often meant ceding authority, inviting foreign influence, or becoming a figurehead while their husbands held real power. Love, or more accurately the social and institutional framework built around romantic attachment, could become a trap, a way of making powerful women palatable or controllable. Yet instead of submitting to these expectations, many queens turned the dichotomy on its head. Elizabeth I declared herself wedded to her kingdom, a move that elevated her beyond conventional gender roles and imbued her sovereignty with a divine, almost mystical quality. Her choice was not loveless. It was a declaration that love could be civic, national, symbolic. Her people were her family. Her courtship rituals with foreign princes were performances of diplomacy, not paths to matrimony. In rejecting marriage, she did not reject affection or loyalty, she redefined them to serve her reign. Cleopatra, often mythologized as a seductress, used romantic relationships not as emotional indulgences but as strategic tools. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony were rooted in mutual benefit and geopolitical necessity. Roman historians reduced her to a temptress, but contemporary assessments increasingly recognize her as a shrewd political actor, one who understood the stakes and wielded her femininity not as weakness but as leverage. Her death, dramatized as the ultimate romantic tragedy, can also be read as an act of political resistance, a final refusal to be paraded in defeat through Rome's streets. Wu Zetian, the only female emperor in Chinese history, climbed the ranks of power by navigating court politics with ruthless precision. She too understood that romantic relationships could be exploited or weaponized, and she managed her own image carefully. By centralizing power and reshaping religious and literary culture to affirm her rule, she broke through Confucian ideals that confined women to the domestic sphere. Her posthumous demonization by male historians underscores just how threatening a woman in full control of political apparatuses was and how that control had to be rationalized as unnatural or immoral. Queen Nzinga of Angola flipped the patriarchal model entirely. Presenting herself in masculine military dress, refusing to marry and taking concubines of her own, she carved out a domain of sovereignty that defied both colonial domination and gender expectations. Her idea of leadership was martial, defiant, uncompromising. She created a new kind of symbolic love, one of fierce loyalty to her people, of sacrificial warfare for the sake of cultural and territorial survival. Catherine the Great, who seized power through a coup and never remarried after her husband's deposition and death, embodied a different kind of transformation. She maintained a vibrant private life with lovers of her choosing, while keeping personal intimacy entirely separate from political structure. Catherine's model was not celibacy but autonomy. She asserted her right to pleasure without allowing it to intersect with governance. Her cultural legacy, the expansion of Russian intellectual and artistic life, was tied to a love of enlightenment, of ideas, of progress. Again, love was not absent, it simply didn't adhere to conventional roles. And Queen Nzinga of Korea, leading with wisdom and religious vision in a deeply male-dominated society, relied on intellectual and symbolic forms of power. She did not marry, and in doing so preserved her autonomy. She ruled not as someone's daughter, wife, or mother, but as a sovereign in her own right. Her people's reverence for her intellect and foresight represented another form of emotional connection, one grounded in trust and admiration rather than romance. What all these women share is not a common narrative of loneliness or isolation, but the audacity to redefine leadership and, by extension, love in a way that served their reigns and preserved their authority. In choosing not to conform to the expected role of a wife or romantic partner, they invited a broader rethinking of what fulfillment, partnership, and legacy could mean. They rejected the premise that a woman's story must be anchored in romantic attachment to be complete. Moreover, their decisions highlight the broader systemic structures that made such choices necessary. In patriarchal societies, the institutions of marriage and love were not designed to empower women, they were often tools of control. Male rulers were seldom expected to choose between love and power, many took both without question. Female rulers, by contrast, were forced into binaries. To assert authority, they had to step outside traditional gender roles. Their celibacy, widowhood, or unconventional partnerships were less about personal denial and more about resisting the limitations imposed on them. Their legacies endure not because they avoided love, but because they reshaped the contours of power to include new expressions of loyalty, service, and emotional connection. Elizabeth I remains a symbol of sovereign independence. Nzinga is celebrated in African histories of resistance. Wu Zetian is being re-evaluated as a transformative leader rather than a usurper. These women offered models of leadership that do not fit neatly into masculine paradigms of dominance or feminine ideals of relational devotion. Instead, they forged a space in between, a sovereign space. In modern culture and politics, their influence continues to ripple. Women leaders today still face questions about how they balance personal life with public duty. The tension between family and leadership remains palpable. But the stories of these queens offer precedent, not warning. They show that love and power are not inherently incompatible, but that in societies structured around male dominance, navigating both requires extraordinary strategy, resilience, and self-definition. These rulers did not simply reject love, they elevated it. They turned it into devotion to country, to ideals, to legacy. They loved as visionaries, as protectors, as reformers. They chose not personal romantic fulfillment, but collective progress. And in doing so, they left behind myths that continue to inspire, challenge, and redefine what it means to rule and what it means to love.